hope everyone has enjoyed the first two presentations as much as I have. Love hearing Mark and Carvey's perspectives on, it's incredible how emotional Greg is about his coaching. Kind of interesting that I didn't know that those two were going to work quite as well together with Mark preceding Greg. But you can just tell in everything that Greg says and everything that he does that there is a huge amount of emotional intelligence and sharing of his true character that's made him as a coach so successful. Our next speaker, Dr. Wayne Frederick. I got to know Dr. Frederick in Washington, D.C. when Sheila and I lived there. And I said in my brief remarks previously, Dr. Frederick is truly a beacon for racial justice, education, and opportunity in America. I first met Dr. Frederick in the dining room of the Four Seasons in Washington, D.C., when he was having breakfast with Vernon Jordan. And there were two legends in Washington, D.C., in the African-American community, Dr. LaSalle Lafall, who was a spectacular surgeon, who was a mentor to Dr. Frederick in his path to becoming one of the great surgeons in Washington, D.C. and at Howard Medical School. And then Vernon Jordan, as Dr. Frederick transitioned from being an incredible surgeon to being the leader that he is today. And to have two mentors, we just heard Carvey talking about how he tries to provide that leadership and that clarity and that character to his players. To have LaSalle Lafall and Vernon Jordan as your two mentors, as two people that I knew quite well throughout my life, and both just recently passed away. There is a lot of LaSalle Lafall as well as Vernon Jordan in Dr. Wayne Frederick. It's an honor and a privilege to have you here, Dr. Frederick. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing your comments about not only the state of racial justice in America, not just what you've done at Howard University to create such an incredible university, but also how we ought to think about both recruiting, training, and retaining the very, very best talent to our companies. And so with that, Dr. Frederick, welcome.
So first let me thank Willie for the invitation. Thanks for having me, I appreciate it. I got the opportunity to sit this morning and listen to the previous two talks. Extremely intriguing, and unfortunately some of what I say is going to be a little bit redundant. I don't think I'm going to say it as well, so please forgive me. I turned 50 last month, and my wife took my family and I think about 30 to 50 of my very close friends and their family to Jamaica, and so I developed laryngitis, which I still am recovering from, so please forgive me. The body doesn't work quite as well as at 50. I got back home to DC and AARP had a letter in my mailbox that I'm refusing to open for a little while. Having said that, to the first speaker, my kids are experiencing some of what he was talking about, extreme anxiety and stress, because they're here with me and they were asking me if I knew what I was going to talk about. And I said I hadn't quite decided yet. And so my 17-year-old son almost had a heart attack, immediately got up and went to the restroom. And my 14-year-old daughter, who will be 15 in 2 weeks, said, I am about to be so embarrassed. And the reason she said that is because one day I gave a talk and was asking for questions from the audience, and she posed a question. And after she posed a question, I started crying before I answered, so I could relate to the coach who spoke previously. So she is still tortured by that, because when we got in the car after, she didn't say, oh, Dad, that was so touching. She was like, I'm so embarrassed. Why did you cry? So with that in mind, I'll start there. So the few things I'm going to talk about. This is a very broad topic, obviously. Racial justice, equality, education, how you recruit diverse talent, and so on. So the first thing I think we need to talk about is how we define diversity. And I think that's sometimes where I have my first uncomfortable moment when I talk to companies and leaders, about diversity. And so I'll start with Howard. Howard is a historically black college and university. There are 106 institutions like that in higher ed in America. Most people don't appreciate why there are even HBCUs or how they came about. We don't choose to call ourselves HBCUs, actually. There's a Higher Education Act that was passed in the 1960s, and one of the amendments led to the creation of HBCUs for the purpose of Title IV funding. So very, very unusual circumstance about the creation, despite the fact that most of the institutions were created before the Higher Education Act. I believe there's only been one institution since the passage of that amendment that has been classified as an HBCU. So part of it is your historical commitment to educating minorities. Howard's birth, I think, is also important. On March 2nd, 1867, the 17th President of the United States, President Johnson, signed into law Howard University, the only federally chartered HBCU. He was a known misogynist, a known racist. He was Abraham Lincoln's vice president, kind of by concession, because he came from Tennessee, and Abraham Lincoln thought it would be a good concession to have him. He would then go on to veto the first Reconstruction Acts. The same guy that started a university for the purpose of teaching slaves moving from the South to the North would veto the first Reconstruction Act. Seemed inconsistent, right? I think what he was thinking is, there's no way this is going to work, so I'm going to do that. Just imagine what happened back in November of last year. He probably rolled around in his grave and said, wait a minute, that's the same university I created that Kamala Harris attended, who's now the first female and black vice president of the United States. He created it. So the first thing I'll say to you is our democracy is messy. It is extremely messy, but it works. And I want to underscore that point, because we live in a society and in a time where we question America's values, we question who we are, what we are, and why. And I think that that's unfortunate, because the tension that exists does sometimes arise in some good, and I would say more so than not. And so even the birth of Howard University and what it is going on to create, whether you agree with the politics or not, we do get great things to come out of some of the dissonance that does exist. I know that seems impossible for you. You guys are probably like, the altitude is probably affecting him. This for him to see dissonance and then think that we're on the right track must be, something must be wrong. But I would say we are probably going to embark on creating a golden generation in this country. And as we try to link recruiting, how you retain diverse talent, that's the first thing we need to do. Who are the students that we're trying to recruit? Right? I have two in my household. My son is a rising senior, and I just came back from Durham last week because he was down at Duke for a soccer camp as they're recruiting him. And being a university president is the worst thing to be when your son is being recruited. He doesn't want me on any of the Zoom calls. I'm constantly asking him questions after. So what did the coach say? Did they talk about academics? Did you tell him you want to be pre-med? And his answers to every one of those questions are, And then I go to my wife and I was like, did he tell you any more than he just told me? And I'm embarrassed because I'm a university president. I have no idea what's going on in these conversations. So young people today have way more access to knowledge. However, they have access to it in short bites. It's very difficult to understand a full concept in 140 characters. But that's what they have access to. So they know way more than we do in a broad sense, but they know much less of it in a very deep sense. And that's not a criticism. That's just a reality. So as we think of how we prepare them for our workplace, we have to be mindful of how they take in information. They don't want the preamble. They want you to get to the meat, what are the pertinent 5 points, and move on. So I had a great idea coming out here. I thought I'd bring the kids, we'd fly into Boise, I'd rent a car, and we'd drive to Sun Valley. So I was like, there's no way, there's nowhere for them to go. They're going to have to talk to us. I'm going to learn about the whole recruiting. I'm going to talk about every school. I've asked my son about 20 million times to create a grid, all the schools, all the different characteristics. This is going to be great. And just before we get in the car, he gets a call from one of the coaches who makes him an offer. So he hangs up the phone and says, Dad, the coach just made me an offer. I was like, what does that mean? Mom and I looked at tuition and fees. Housing, it's $81,000. You're not going to qualify for financial aid. Is he paying for tuition, housing, board? He said, oh no, he just made me an offer. I said, I'm missing something here. Can we have a conversation about this? So needless to say, what was going to be a 3-hour pleasant ride turned into a 5-minute conversation that quickly ended with everybody acting like they were asleep. And since I was driving, I could not act like I was asleep. So they do have a lot of information. The other thing, if you look at data on young people, is they are the most altruistic generation of the 5 generations that are alive today in the workplace. This generation is the most altruistic. Now, that's probably difficult to swallow. How could people who spend so much time on their cell phones be altruistic? They actually are extremely compassionate. They display empathy. They're very concerned about other people who don't look like them, don't live in the same places they do, aren't in the same social stratosphere as they are. And I know as some of you think about the younger people in your family, as you start thinking about it, just think of how many of them come to you with issues that aren't related to them. So I was on one of these trips giving a talk. My daughter called me on FaceTime. She's 14 now, so she probably at the time was 9 or 10. And she said to me, Dad, guess what? I just learned how to sign. I was like, okay. We don't know anybody who signs. I'm not exactly sure why this is like a breaking news moment, but I will stop everything I'm doing. And she then said, look, and she put the phone up and went through the entire alphabet. And she said, by the way, let me give you a few phrases that you can use. So she goes through this whole thing, and of course I'm trying to be the compassionate, loving dad, and I listen very intently. And then I said to her, so why exactly did you do this? And she said, well, I was looking at a TV show, and one of the characters was deaf. And it occurred to me that we walk around every day, and we have no concern about people who can't communicate like that. And I think all of us have a responsibility to learn to sign. And I thought to myself, man, this is unbelievable that somebody at that age would have, there's nobody in our family. We've never been in a social setting where any of us had to sign. It was unbelievable. 2 things would happen within 2 years of that incident. The new Gallaudet president would take the job, and Gallaudet, for those of you who may not know, is a university in DC for the hearing impaired. She would take the job and she would ask me to give one of the speeches. And I thought to myself, my goodness. And so, of course, my daughter had taught me a few phrases, etc., and I was able to use that. But the second thing was even more important. She would go to another grade, and a young girl in her class had parents who were deaf. The first time she went over there, her parents lit up. They were like, wow. And so they loved her coming over there. Right? So that empathy does exist in our young people. So we have to understand who we're trying to attract. People who have lots of information, not necessarily very deep, very altruistic and empathetic about people who aren't quite like them. And some of the knowledge they have is dangerous. So one thing I would say about them as well is they also, I would say, and I want to make sure that I am politically correct about this, but they are very entitled. But I'll explain entitlement, because entitlement is not because they have resources or are rich. It's entitlement because of the knowledge that they have. So the Billionaires Summer Camp that was here last week, all of these, whether they're Pell Grant eligible or not, they know who the richest person in the world is every week. If it changes in order, they know what type of jet they fly. They know who graduated from college and who didn't. And so one of the things that they come to our universities with is that should be me, right? And that's a sense of entitlement, strange entitlement. Because sometimes when we think of entitlement, we think, oh, I'm just going to call my dad to fix this. It's a different type of entitlement. It's an entitlement of knowledge. It's an entitlement of you have something that you got lucky and I'm working hard for, and I should have your luck. Right? That's sometimes how it's translated. If I were to show you the emails I get from students about housing, etc., you'd have a heart attack. So I talk about tone and tenor a lot at my university, on deaf ears. There's no tone and tenor. You say what you feel, you say what you think. I'm still a yes, ma'am, yes, sir. I still think you solve problems by attracting people to your side. That's another group of people you're trying to recruit. They want it done now. They want to talk to Willie. They don't want to talk to whoever is next in line. They go straight to the president. My housing assignment got mixed up. I need you to fix this. I'm not even sure where all the residence halls are. I'm like, trust me, you don't want me to fix it. I could fix it, but you might be happy with how I fix it. But that's how they approach. So with that in mind, how do we then think of recruiting them and retaining them in this environment of some of the tension around what they're experiencing? And let me be very clear. What they're experiencing is very real. This is the other thing that I hope you'll go away with this and be mindful of. So my son decided a few years ago that the top half of his hair he was going to stop combing and let it grow. And he would shave the sides. And so I came home one day and they were explaining to me that this is where we were going with the hairstyle. Now, this occurred around the same time I was beginning to lose the top half of my hair. So there was a little bit of jealousy, but there was a lot of anxiety because I was thinking to myself, what would people see when they see you? Right? Genuine concern. Teenage kid, hair uncombed on the top. I'm the president of a historically black college and university. I see that every day. But I was concerned. And that made me stop and ask myself, why was I concerned? What am I thinking about? I still teach, I still operate. And so every med school class that comes through me, I pose a question to them when I lecture to them. If you see me on Georgia Avenue opposite Howard Hospital in jeans, a t-shirt, Timberland boots, a hoodie even, would you think that I am a surgeon, the father of two who lives in the same house with his kids, and the president of Howard University? I'm yet to have a single student at Howard University put their hand up and say, those would be the thoughts that would come to my mind. So the other thing we have to be realistic about is our perception of people. That's just a reality. And sometimes we get uncomfortable because we don't want to admit that those are the thoughts that go through our mind. So yesterday, my wife, when I got here, she went to get me some lozenges, etc., while I was on a call. And she came back in the room and said, a black lady saw her while she was walking across and stopped and said, hi, do you live here? And my wife was like, no, I'm visiting. She's like, man, you're the second black person I've seen. And so my wife was like, a little taken aback. But it's true, we're in Idaho. Right? I walked into the reception, I was like, okay. I know all of these black people, I've seen them before. There are no new black people in Idaho for me to meet. So my point is that our brains work in such a way that that's what we do. We see people and we process. It's a physiologic reaction to what we do, right? So I'll tell a story about that. That will embarrass my wife a little bit, but I'll tell a story about that. We lived in Connecticut. We would go to Manhattan just to have something to do. Living in Farmington, Connecticut wasn't exactly exciting. And I got on the elevator. We stayed at Times Square because we wanted the maximum excitement, as you can imagine. And I got on the elevator one day, and a guy who looked exactly like Alec Baldwin, I swear to you to this day, was on the elevator. And I got on, and he said, "Hi, how are you today? Everything is going well?" And I thought to myself, I'm in New York City, dude. Why are you speaking to me? People in New York don't speak to strangers on the street. We're in a closed elevator. The next person got on the elevator, he did the same thing. "Hi, how are you? Man, the weather out there is nice today, isn't it?" And I thought to myself, who is this guy? And I got off the elevator, I ran to my room, I said to my wife, "Listen, I just met a guy on the elevator that totally made my day." I was like, this guy was so engaging, it was unbelievable. Now, what happens on the elevator? Usually, we get on and we take out our phone. You just check your text. There's no new text. But we all check our text because we don't want to interact, right? The essence of the human condition is interaction. It's not isolation. That's why the past year has been so difficult. Even the introverts want to be in the room. They just don't want you to talk to them, right? So the essence of the human condition is interaction. So my wife blows me off, as usual. She's like, "Oh, you get excited about the most mundane things." That evening, we go out, we get back on the elevator. Alec Baldwin's lookalike is on the elevator. I start smiling immediately. I'm like, this dude is just going to kill it. Sure enough, he says, "Hey, hi. Oh, you guys are dressed so nicely. Where are you coming from?" I'm looking at my wife, my eyes wide open. And she's like, "Went to dinner." Next person gets on the elevator, same thing. We get off the elevator, and she says, "Wow, that was refreshing." I said, "Exactly, I told you." So I have a rule at work that when you get on the elevator, you have to put your phone away and just say hi, right? So I say that to say that with the young people, one of the key things that they're looking for is that engagement, believe it or not. They're on their phone because they don't want to initiate it, but they want to hear from you. They want your sage advice. They want you to spend time with them, asking them what they think, why they think it, and filling in the gaps in their knowledge. Because there are gaps in their knowledge base about several things in our society, especially around issues of racial justice and inequality. There are things that they don't understand, necessarily get to comprehend or speak about, because we all have that bit of discomfort, but they actually want to hear from you. They want you to sit and do that. So in our home, we try to practice that to some extent. And as I say this because as these young people are trying to come to you, I want you to think of what are the ways that you can engage them where they are. So every New Year's Eve or New Year's Day, we have dinner as a family. We've been doing this now for, I think, 7 years. And the topic of discussion is estate planning and family wealth, of which there was very little 7 years ago. But it was an engaging conversation. So we discuss our will, we discuss the expectations for what we want them to do, etc. There's one theme. We want our kids to be good people to everybody. There's no, we want you to be a doctor. My wife has a degree in computer science. Simple rule. But then we go over the finances. If we both were to perish today, this is what would happen. I remember after the first time we did it, my wife was bawling. She was like, "We are torturing these kids." This last year we did it, especially in the middle of the pandemic. Our kids were like, so, can we go to boarding school? And how much exactly of this amount of money on the insurance do we get up front? I was like, wait a minute, you guys are... The sophistication level here is getting a little concerning. But my point is, they want to be engaged. They want to be drawn in. And especially when you talk about diverse kids, they don't have that. So they're coming to college with knowledge, entitlement, feelings, empathy. But the average diverse kid who's coming from a low-income bracket is not necessarily getting that engagement. So we have to create opportunities of how we engage and how we recruit. So on the recruitment, I'll talk about a couple of things on the recruitment. I interviewed to be a fellow at Memorial Sloan Kettering. I did general surgery at Howard. I was at MD Anderson Cancer Center doing research. And I decided that I have MD Anderson Cancer Center on my resume. I would now get Memorial Sloan Kettering on my resume, and I would have been at the 2 best cancer centers in the world. No brainer. So I go up to Manhattan after living in Houston for 2 years, and the interview process had 2 interesting elements that I want you to think about. The first was a cocktail party the night before. I didn't drink back then. I started back drinking when I married my wife, but we could discuss that later. I didn't drink back then. And so I go into this room. I'm the only black applicant. Cocktail tables are set up. The fellows who are training there are distributed all around the room. And the purpose for the fellows in there is to assess the candidates in terms of how many tables they move around to. Of course, I don't know that as an applicant. So I do what I do when I go to every room, including today. I go to the furthest part of the room, and I sit down, because to some extent, I'm shy. So I went to the cocktail table at the furthest end of the room, ordered a bottle of water, and had a grand old time by myself. While these folks were walking around taking notes about the fact that I didn't leave that table. The second part of the interview, the last room, they showed me a picture, a black and white picture, of a very older-looking white gentleman in, I would say, 1800 and something clothing. So one of the big things in surgery, especially academic surgery, is how many surgeons have won Nobel Prizes. And so I had that list in my head. I looked at the picture, didn't recognize this old white guy, but was convinced he won a Nobel Prize. At that time, there were 5 of them. I was like, I just gotta pick one. 20% chance. Rolled the dice, picked one. The guy was like, no. I was like, okay. We get to the next room. Actually, that was the penultimate room. The next room, a guy said to me in the room, who did you meet last night at the cocktail party that you would want to train with? I met one guy because I was at that table in the far end of the room. There's only one person's name I could remember, and so I blurted out his name, and luckily for me, I would learn later on, he blurted out my name when he was asked the same question. So part of their assessment was whose name gets mentioned more in that setting. Now, if you're trying to recruit diverse talent, that's probably the single worst thing you're gonna do. Kid from Trinidad and Tobago, you're gonna show him a picture of an old white guy who turned out to be William Harrison, the president with the shortest tenure, right? Gave a speech, his inauguration speech, in deathly cold weather and died 30 days later. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. I barely knew how many presidents there were, far less William Harrison, the one with the shortest tenure. So if you're trying to recruit diverse talent, you definitely are not going to get me in that pool. And so one of the things I would urge you to think about is, now that's extreme, but what are the things you do when you're recruiting that may actually be barriers to getting the talent? I would argue that one of them is where you go, right? You don't go to fish for trout in a salmon pond. right? Sounds like it makes sense, but that's what people do, right? They say they went to look and they didn't see any talent. Well, on my campus, I got almost 12,000 students, and I could tell you I probably can't get into Howard right now because of the kind of talent. We send more African Americans to medical school. You guys are in business. The number one supplier of black students to Harvard's MBA program over the last 55 years, which was when they took their first black MBA student, is Harvard undergrad. Number two, Howard University. So it would, if I were in business and you're really obsessed about getting a Harvard MBA grad and you have some interest in diverse talent, then that's where I would go. I would think about it. The other thing is you have to define diversity and what that means. Because sometimes we have a little confusion about what that means. So I get to the Howard presidency, and I look at the deans. I have a meeting one day, and there's one female dean out of 13 schools and colleges. And I thought to myself, geez, our DNA is social justice. We have one woman dean. We've been around for almost 150 years, and we've got one woman dean. 17 men have run Howard, 17 of us. I'm only the 7th black man. 10 of my predecessors have been white men. And here we are with one woman dean. So I decided we were going to change that. Every city for a dean, I appoint. It has to be gender balanced. Everybody go for cultural competency training and unconscious bias training. So just imagine at Howard trying to convince faculty to go for unconscious bias training and cultural competency training, right? So that was the first time they almost tarred and feathered me, right? Because they were like, this is ridiculous. And every one of them that goes comes back and says, I'm glad you did that. Because I did not realize the biases that I had within. I will not interview a finalist unless of the 3 finalists, one of them is a woman. And I will not allow the search committee to rank the finalists. And the reason for that last part is because you never know what can go wrong. In a background check, in negotiating, this guy may want $1 million, I could only afford $500,000. I don't want to go back to a search committee and say, hey. Most importantly, though, I don't want the faculty to go back and say, when that person is a failed dean, we told him that was our number 3 choice, right? Because that's what they will do. So, and now we have 10 women deans out of 14 as a result of doing that. So my point about that is leadership. It has to start with leadership. I'm going to say something else that's unpopular. I'm not a big fan of DEI chiefs. And I said that once on a call with DEI chiefs. And they took it well. The reason I say that is because I believe that DEI efforts lead to the bottom line. CEOs rarely give up portfolios that don't lead to the bottom line or don't have massive involvement in it. And I would argue that every CEO should have that as one of their priorities. And so even if you have a chief, that's somebody that you should be tied to the hip with to make sure that you're participating in what the activity is. Now, most of these kids, I would suggest to you, want the same things that anybody you're recruiting wants. The difference is that they want to come in sometimes to a little bit more of a family. They want to know that you are concerned and care about what they're doing. And that's because they are going to be on the outside of that. And I've been that person. I went to UConn, there were 2 black surgeons. That comes with a different type of pressure. And I would describe UConn's recruitment of me, which I thought was absolutely spot on. They met me at a conference in San Francisco, My wife, who was then my girlfriend, was at the conference. They took us to dinner. We had a great talk. The very next visit in November, they had her come with me, which I thought was unusual. We weren't married, but they were like, oh, you should bring her with you. I was like, this is a little strange, but I'll take her with me. We went. And then in January, they had me come back for a second visit. And they were like, oh, you don't need to bring your girlfriend. So now I was a little offended. I was like, you had to come to the first visit. That was unusual. Now, second visit, time to close the deal. She's not there. I landed. There was snow everywhere. I called her, and I was like, I think I figured out why they don't want you here. She's from Trinidad, as I am. There was snow everywhere. So they made a tactical move that worked out well. She had never seen snow. They knew that she was not signing up for that had she come and seen that snow. And so sure enough, they got me to sign on and come there. So sometimes I think thinking through the process of what you're trying to achieve is important. And then I'm going to give Willie back his time. A very important aspect, in my opinion, of recruiting is retention. We all get very caught up in the new and shiny, and that always bothers me. I rewrote the headline when we announced Nicole Hannah-Jones and Ta-Nehisi Coates were going to come to Howard 1,000,001 times. I insisted that it included that they were going to join our faculty in the headline. Initially, the headline said they're joining Howard's award-winning faculty. Didn't like it, changed it to illustrious. Why was that important? Because when you recruit talent, they are often going to take their cues from how you treat the people who are there. And if they see certain things coming in, they're going to adopt that as the norm. And so I think it is extremely important with diverse talent to make sure that you're making efforts today to manage the folks who are there in a way that they can speak up. All right, so I'll tell you a story about that. My CFO, who unfortunately passed in February on Super Bowl Sunday, was a Jewish guy from Philly. And 2 years ago, he was going away for Rosh Hashanah, I think it was a holiday. And I remember thinking to myself, this guy gets off every Jewish holiday. It must be awkward. There must be somebody on this team who is just a little uncomfortable with that. They're never going to say it, but there must be somebody on this team. So I said to him, I called him up, I said, Mike, when you come back, I want you to do me a favor. For our cabinet meeting, the first cabinet meeting, when you come back, I want you to explain what holiday you went to celebrate, what you did, and why. And, you know, Mike was a really, really nice guy. He agreed to do it. I get to cabinet meeting in the boardroom. He has dishes laid out on the table. And so I get to the room and I'm like, oh my goodness, what's going on here? And he proceeds to explain what the holiday was about. He opens up a grocery bag with green apples, starts cutting them, takes out honey, starts dipping. And I'm like, what is going on? He's animated. I mean, we've had some good years, and I haven't seen him this animated over the numbers. And he is so excited. And everybody else in the room is equally as animated. And I started looking around the room, and I realized that I gave him agency that he did not previously have. And how often do we do that? How often do we stop ourselves to give agency to others, recognizing that all they want to do, as you've heard several times earlier today, is be their full selves, even in an environment where they may not be a lot of them. And after he did that, I can tell you, our team functioned differently. When Jewish holidays would come, people would crack jokes. Is chocolate involved in this, Mike? I mean, but I could tell people were like embracing who he was. And I think that that's important. And so I'm going to close so that you can get a chance to ask questions. And also, like I said, I want to give Willie back his time. I want to close with two things: mentorship and allyship. I encourage young people to not only look for mentors, but to recognize that mentors come in all shapes and sizes. And I encourage you to become mentors purposefully, not passively. Go into those parts of your organization and find those people who nobody else is speaking to. You've been in those meetings where there's just one quiet person. You could look at their face and know that they're thinking something different. You know that they have an idea percolating. But we all get so busy, we don't want to circle back to that one person, just to ask that one other question. As you heard from Willie, I've been blessed with mentors. But those two mentors he mentioned, Dr. LaSalle Lafall was the first black president of the American College of Surgeons, the American Cancer Society. In my opinion, probably the single best surgeon ever. He sought me out. He insisted that I come back to Howard and take over his surgical practice. He treated me like a son. Never understood why I deserved that, but he decided that that's what he was going to do. Vernon Jordan. The first time I ever met Vernon Jordan, at that same Four Seasons that Willie's talking about, I got a call from him saying, I want to have breakfast with you. And I thought to myself, why is Vernon Jordan calling me to ask me about having breakfast? So I called Dr. LaFall and I said, listen, I know you know Vernon Jordan. He just asked me to breakfast. Why? And he just said, I think you should go. Of course, never realizing that he had something to do with it as well. I get to breakfast and he asked me two questions. Do you want to be Howard's president? I said, no, we have a president. He's like, good, keep saying that. And then his next question was, what can I do for you? Everybody that I meet with wants something. I said, Mr. Jordan, I don't want anything. I'm already uncomfortable with the last question. And he's like, no, tell me what can I do for you? I said, I don't want anything. And he said, listen, we're not leaving here until you tell me what I could do for you. And I said, well, okay. President Obama is going to Morehouse to give the commencement speech. I'm the provost at this time, by the way, so I have nothing to do with this. And I said, however, we don't have a commencement speaker yet. And I think it might be wise for us to send a message to the White House that we have friends to. So can you get us President Clinton? To which he calmly says, I'll call Bill. But in the event that Bill is busy, what about these other people? And I'm thinking, who calls the former President Bill? Right? So while he's mentioning these other names, I'm like thinking, this is ridiculous. Why am I talking to this man about this stuff? So I get up and leave, and sure enough, 3 days later, he calls me and says, Wayne, President Clinton will be your commencement speaker. But you have to promise me something. You're not going to tell the president how this happened. So I said, okay, I could do that. But he was testing me. So sure enough, about 30 minutes later, I get a call from the president. Can you come into the office? I go into the office. He says, guess who our commencement speaker is going to be? So I said, who? He said, President Clinton. I said, wow. He said, one of these days, I'll tell you how I did that. I said, I can't wait to hear that story. And I left the room. So, of course, Vernon called me back. He was like, did he tell you? I said, yeah. And he said, what did you say? I told him what he said, and I said, I can't wait to hear that story. He was like, you're a good man. Mentors are critical, but mentorship is a two-way street. Mentors get as much from their mentees as we give. And you have to recognize that. Those two men took more pride in my being the president at Howard than I ever will have. Because all I'm trying to do is pay them a debt of gratitude that I owe to what I think is one of America's greatest romance stories, that institution, Howard University, that was started to educate freed slaves moving from the South, that could send a woman to the White House, that could take a kid from Trinidad and Tobago with sickle cell and make him a cancer surgeon and ultimately make him her president. So the last thing I'm going to leave you with is this. At the end of the day, diversity, equality, and inclusion are about humanity. And what I would suggest to you is that we are at a time in our history in society where the amplification of each other's humanity is the single most important task we have every day. And that amplification of humanity doesn't mean that you have to go out and hire all the diverse talent that there is. What it means is that every day we all have a personal responsibility to block and tackle and make the humanity of somebody else that much more amplified every day. George Floyd was murdered, but just as importantly, he was dehumanized. And so ultimately, when we talk about racial justice and we tie it to all these other things, it is about amplifying each other's humanity. The guy in the elevator in New York amplified everybody's humanity by simply making eye contact on an elevator every day and saying hello. Sometimes we think we have to do big things to change the world around us. We don't. Sometimes we think diverse talent need all kinds of extra things for us to get them to come and find a home with us, and that's not the case. All they need is for you to look at them for who they are and amplify their humanity. Thanks for your attention, and I appreciate it.
I've got the microphone here for any questions. Dr. Frederick, given what's happened over the past year and the desire and real focus on recruiting diverse talent, how do people who run companies that are here who want to recruit diverse talent get a foothold at a university like Howard that has got such exceptionally talented students, where they're going up against the Goldman Sachses and the McKinseys of this world that are there with a big reputation, a big brand, and are recruiting many of your students?
Yeah, so I would say first, don't show up to just get the talent. Every time I have this conversation with people, I say to them, listen, we are an institution. Let's get to know each other. Help me understand your values. Bring my faculty, my administrators into your company. Let them get to understand who you are, what you do, why you do it. And then let's figure out a way for you to invest in these students' education. Because ultimately, the students that you're trying to recruit, they want to see that interest. And if you show that interest in their education, they ultimately are going to feel more comfortable coming to you, right? You talk about the big ticket names. The most successful recruiter, I would say, at Howard University probably has been J.P. Morgan. But not because of the size of the bank, but because of Jamie Dimon. He's been coming there since 1989, himself. He comes to Howard every single year himself to recruit students. 2015, he was my Child of the Day speaker. We had a luncheon after. I was going to the luncheon, and they arranged for him to meet with 20 students who were in the J.P. Morgan intern program. And he was like, I'll be right up. Lunch was over. I went back downstairs to the room. He was in a room with 20 students for 2 hours answering every question. I don't care what Chase brand is or JP Morgan's brand is. Those students feel like they know who Jamie Dimon is. And so his active involvement, I think, has made that ability to recruit. Now, I'm not saying every CEO should come to Howard. Let me be clear. I'm also realistic about that. But the people you send should really be thinking about their consistency of effort and making sure that they show up in terms of the bilateral nature of the engagement.
Sheila? It should be on. Was.
You hear me? Okay, there
Yeah.
I am. Thank you so much. I loved your comments, and I am especially interested in the hopeful and optimistic note you sounded about the rising generation. I think you called it the golden generation. I'm curious about two elements of that. One, what are those characteristics, kind of central characteristics other than altruism, that characterize this group of young people? And the second is, I'm a behavioral geneticist, and we know, nurture shapes nature. The genes are expressed by virtue of the environments we're in. How do we nurture the nature of this group of young people to activate them and give them the agency to go out and be change agents for racial justice and diversity and equity and health and all the things we need our society to move forward?
Yeah, great questions. And obviously I'm biased because, I'm responsible for two of them, so they better be the golden generation. But having said that, I think some of the other characters, they are problem solvers, right? So again, I'll embarrass my kids, but I'll use my kids. My daughter's last call to me when I was away last week was, I want to start a nonprofit. I was like, okay, what's this nonprofit going to do? And she was very focused on me investing in it rather than explaining to me what it was going to do. But the point is, I wasn't thinking about a nonprofit when I was 14. I was the nonprofit. I was trying to get money and investment. So my point is that they are problem solvers, and I think we have to give them opportunities to be part of that problem solving. They see very little, I would say, bright lines between the work they do day to day and the social justice elements around them. And the more we avoid resisting that, the better. So at Howard, I have a group of about 50 people who are 50 or younger that I call the Howard Forward Group. So they're mid-managers, they're up-and-coming folks, and I meet with them once a month. And it's off the record, any question you want to ask me. And they tend to ask me, most questions are about decisions I've made that have implications about the environment around us, the social environment, et cetera. And I take those questions head on, even when I disagree, even when they know I'm going to disagree, or even when they know I've made a statement that suggests that I disagree. But the fact that I'm willing to do that makes them feel comfortable. And my argument is, you're going to lead the organization in the future, so why wait for us to start training you around doing that? And the last thing I would say is we have to be more deliberate. In academia, we don't do that. Universities are like flotillas, right? Every now and then I lose a ship, I got to go back and get the College of Fine Arts, get them to come back in. And one of the problems there is that we have to be purposeful about training. You get promoted in academia because you do well in academia, not because you manage budgets well, not because you manage investments well, not because you handle conflict well. So I send anybody who's aspiring to be a chair or a dean out to training. And I think that's the other thing we have to look at when we bring young people in. What are the deficits they may have, and how do we train them around that? I think a lot of industry now trains students, trains, I should say, our graduates, but as soon as they finish training them, the attrition rate is high because you train them for other people. My argument is, while they're with us, help us train them the way you want them so that they develop some kind of fealty towards you and they don't leave,
We have time for one more.
Can you hear me? Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time and your comments. My question really follows on that last comment that you were just making around retention. I'm curious, not just with the faculty that you manage at your college, but alums or maybe others that you may mentor. Have you seen or heard anecdotally commonalities of diverse talent who may be mid-career and then hit stumbling blocks and feel like there aren't opportunities to advance? Are there common themes that you can share with the people in the room to help people get through those stumbling blocks?
Yeah, absolutely. One is the conversation took place too late. The conversation shouldn't have taken place when they're mid-career. Coming in, I think we have to do a better job of where you're heading. What's your interest? What are the types of things you want to be exposed to so that we can build out your portfolio and your experiences? I think that conversation takes place way too late. The second thing is, I think sometimes diverse talent, they do a great job right where they are, but a lot of times people are looking for a wide variety of other characteristics. I sit on 6 corporate boards, and we talk a lot about succession planning. And I'm amazed at how often the firms who help us with this issue do not talk about how well these people do their jobs. They talk about all these intangibles that I often say, so how exactly was Susie supposed to know that you guys wanted her to be doing more corporate responsibility stuff if nobody said that to her for the past 5 years? You know, I mean, some of these things aren't intuitive. So if you know that there's certain things you're looking for, then you've got to expose people to that. So I would say, you know, another common theme is just not having that conversation, you know, fully early on. And then the third thing is a lack of allyship and sponsorship. It is an issue. And it's an issue that can occur anywhere. My first faculty job was at the University of Connecticut. We had one black neurosurgeon and myself. There was nobody else at a higher level who looked like me. And that's where I really started to double down on you have to have mentors that are diverse. Right? And I try to tell young people that. I ended up leaving there without a mentor. So the 3 years I spent there, no one was a go-to person for me if I had an issue. That's not a place that I would have ultimately thrived. You know, as opposed to, I got back to Howard and I had a Dr. LaFall, you know, I had a Vernon Jordan. I mean, it was very, very different. I had a Clive Callender, and the last thing I would say is, I think sometimes the other commonality is that the mentors are not diverse in terms of what they give you, right? So I have a mentor called, his name is Clive Callender. He probably has done more for minority transplantation than any single surgeon who has ever lived. In 2008, I think, I had just moved back to Howard for 2 years, and I said to him, you know, I used to be an altar boy in an Anglican church, and while I don't feel I'm religious, I feel like I'm lacking a spiritual component to my life. And he said, okay, I'll text you tomorrow. And every day since then, 2008, 13 years later, he texts me every single morning a word of scripture. If I don't respond and say thanks, he says, are you dead? He's a little bit sarcastic. He's a New Yorker. But this morning, he texts me. So this is the last thing I'm going to say just to make a point to you. Right, so here's a transplant surgeon who is a mentor, and what he provides for me is spiritual grounding. And so his text this morning it was 4:36 here because he doesn't know I'm in Idaho, of course, not that he would care, was Joshua 1, verse 9. Now, I could look up the scripture, but he actually writes out the scripture every single time. Right? Have not I commanded thee, be strong and of good courage. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed. For the Lord thy God is with thee whatsoever thou goest. So my point is, I think, you know, when I talk about diverse mentors, it's not just about how they look, but what they give you, right? Because what he has given me over 13 years, 365 days a year, regardless of what continent either of us is on, is the same consistent thing every single day, right? Just imagine that. He's a transplant surgeon. He doesn't tell me about how to tie my knots, doesn't tell me how to manage my surgical patients, but he gives me a word of scripture for me to think about every day.
On that, thank you, Dr. Frederick, very, very much.